Before I interviewed my guest today, I had the opportunity to read her memoirs she wrote last year entitled A Life of Quality and Quantity. I devoured that book and was thrilled and sad at the same time when I was done. Thrilled that I got a look into a life well lived and still well living, but sad because I was at the end of her incredible book. Miss Betty Cleveland will tell you she has been blessed with a wonderful life. She describes her 93 years on earth to date as not perfect, but close. I believe when you hear her story, you will agree. But perfect certainly doesn't mean easy. When you were born 3 months after the great stock market crash of 1929 and raised during the Great Depression, things were certainly a long way from easy. Her life is proof that you can experience peace in the midst of chaos and confidence in the midst of uncertainty. Raised by wise parents, young Betty Cleveland was taught wonderful life lessons she would apply for the remainder of her life and would pass down to her children. Despite their circumstances, seeds were planted in her life that would one day produce a great harvest. For starters, her life always centered around the church and her faith. Becoming an accomplished pianist would bring her much joy in her life. She has a special love for the old hymns of the church. Like many of us, she knows all the words and has sung them over and over. But unlike most of us, she has beautifully played them over and over, almost her entire life. One of the lessons she learned and passed down to her children was that of frugality. She learned firsthand from her parents that if you are frugal, you can be generous. And generosity only makes one richer. Frugality also allows for investments. Betty Cleveland's parents invested in her in many ways, including making sure she was exposed to the world outside the little towns of northeast Georgia. Those investments from her early years paid off and created in her an insatiable desire for learning and a love for traveling. If you live to be 93, you get to experience most everything life can throw at you, like the loss of beloved grandparents, parents, a close cousin, siblings, and a beloved husband of over 60 years. But with all those losses come many wins, like watching your children grow up, marry, and become successful, and then seeing them bring you the gifts of wonderful grandchildren and great-grandchildren. When Miss Cleveland married and moved to Fort Valley, she became the wife of a full-fledged farmer and pretty much became an expert on farming. Her biggest takeaway is no matter how good of a farmer one is, success is totally dependent on Mother Nature and a God who is in complete control. I think most of us can agree the same is true about life. I wonder if Ernest and Ellie Thomas can look down at their youngest daughter now and see how her life has turned out. If they can, they know their labor of love in raising her was certainly not in vain, and they have to be rejoicing at what they have witnessed. One of Miss Cleveland's favorite old hymns is Bringing in the Sheaves, written by Noel Shaw in 1874 and inspired by Psalm 126:6. These are farmers' words and spiritual words. Those who go out weeping, carrying seed to sow, will return with songs of joy, carrying sheaves with them. Bringing in sheaves, by the way, was a symbol of abundance and prosperity and a perfect picture of this special lady who has lived a wonderful life. Betty Cleveland's parents did their part as well as any parent can do it, but they were totally dependent on a God who is rich in mercy and grace, who wrote her story with his hand. What an abundant harvest we see.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
This is Bruce Goddard, and you're listening to the View from a Hearse podcast. I've got a very special guest with me today. She taught me English literature in the 12th grade at Peach County High School, and she also taught a ton of other kids for about 30 years in Fort Valley area. And I've also, her daughter, her oldest child, Tavy, is listening in, and she may jump in and add to this conversation. So thank both of you for doing this. Thank you for being on here with me. I can't wait to talk to you. Miss Cleveland was born in 1930. She celebrated her 93rd birthday on January 25th of this year. Tavy, I knew her. I've known her for 50 years or whatever. She was a year ahead of me in school, so I'm talking to folks I've known a long time. I hadn't seen them much, but I've known them a long time. So, Miss Cleveland, let's start by talking about you grew up in Hart County, Georgia, and that's in northeast Georgia, and you've got a lot of fond memories of Hart County. So let's start there.
My family moved to Hart County. We first moved to Newburgh. Daddy was principal of the county school at Nancy Hart Community. I was not even first grade by then at that time. So as Daddy was principal of the school, he got to do, well, I think he was more than principal because he dealt with farmers a lot, and their soil was washing away. You've heard of the Red Hills of Georgia.
Yep.
That made for the good soil to be washed into the Savannah River or whatever. As time went by, Daddy realized that so many of the farmers were having a hard time because the soil was so bad. He started what's called the Clover Blossom Festival. It made the community aware, and people outside the community aware that they needed to enrich the soil with the clover, with crimson clover.
So he actually got the farmers to plant crimson clover to enrich the soil. Yeah, wow.
They had a Clover Blossom Festival.
Right.
It was an annual affair with barbecue and everything like that.
He was the extension agent there as well, right?
Exactly. Well, at that time, he was just in Nancy Hart, but later on, he became the county agent for the whole county.
Well, you obviously had wonderful parents, and you also have great memories with your grandparents. Your Walters on your mother's side, Thomas's on your father's side. I mentioned earlier that she has written her memoirs. Miss Cleveland has written her memoirs that I've had the pleasure to read in the last couple of days. But one of the things that you wrote about was when you were a kid visiting your Granny Walters for 2 weeks at a time in the summer. And I think about, people used to do that, and not many people do that now. And I'm sure that had to be quite an adventure, spending 2 weeks with her there, that it was very exciting for you.
It was just a fun time because there were other cousins in the neighborhood, and we would, do things and just have a good time. And Grandma had a boarding house, and there weren't very many boarders, but there was one particular one that he was fond of me, and I was, like 4 or 5 years old or 6 years old. It's what you call a jobber, I think. He traveled, and he would be there. Sometime I was there. And another thing I enjoyed at Granny Dory's was her garden. She had a lot of vegetables and tomatoes and things like that. And the food was always so good. Fried chicken was just really great.
One of the things you mentioned is that he gave you a book that you still, the guy that stayed in the boarding house regularly gave you a book that you still have today and still treasure, right?
I do, and it's a book of poems and about patriotism. This is World War II.
Right.
I treasure it so much that he thought enough of me to give me a book.
One of the funny stories, too, about talking about your grandparents, you had one of your grandmothers that read the Bible every day. She was very disciplined about reading the Bible, but she smoked a pipe. And that's a funny story how she started smoking the pipe. Do you remember that story?
About Grandpa, yeah. And she would get the pipe and put the tobacco in it and start it and then hand it to him, and he'd smoke it. And then when he got ready to get through, he'd hand it back to him. He said, "Don't let this go to waste, the tobacco."
So she became a pipe smoker because she was starting
Yeah.
it for him. That is a great story.
I bet she probably thought it was terrible for a lady to smoke a cigarette, but it was all right for her to smoke a pipe. Yeah.
Another thing that you mentioned that people, especially younger people, probably won't understand. Of course, y'all were a very close-knit family. You got two sisters, Mary Frances and Evelyn, and you've got these memories of riding these dirt roads. Back then, that's pretty much all you had was dirt roads, right?
And wide ditches on the side. And when it rained a little bit, you just slid right in the ditch. I remember vividly just cringing and holding onto the seat as we slide down a red hill. You've heard the red hills of Georgia. We were on those red hills.
So the interesting part is people listening to this is never ridden a dirt road in their life. And right. but you really have a fear for dirt roads because
I do. I hated it. We'd go up there on Sunday afternoons, and if it was raining, I just didn't even want to go.
Yeah, and there's one story you told you in a Model A, and you in the middle because you were the youngest and smallest, and of course there were no seat belts or anything like that, and you hit something and slammed on brakes, and you had knocked your front teeth out, right?
That's right. Now that was a little bit different. That was in Athens, and we were heading to Middle Georgia, I think, and I have two, as I said, you said, have two sisters, and of course they were older than me and more prestigious, so they got the outside seats, and I had to sit in the center, and nothing to hold to. And I remember that curve is still there on Lumpkin Street, where Daddy had to avoid a car or a dog or something and swerved, and I fell off the seat and bumped the front seat and knocked my front, thank goodness, baby teeth out and swallowed one. And I'll never forget that.
I'm going to go back to Hart County when you were, before you got to Athens. I remember you moved to Athens right before your senior year in high school. That was that was kind of a difficult time for you. We'll talk about that. But in Hart County or in Hartwell, of course, you didn't have televisions when you were growing up in those days. And they had a theater that you guys went down and watched cartoons on Saturday, and that was your introduction to cartoons, and it was great entertainment.
The Benson Bread Company out of Athens, and I hadn't figured out that relationship. But anyway, this Benson Bread Company, I don't know if they owned the theater or what, but every Saturday we'd go down about from 9 to 12 and watch cartoons. And then in the afternoons, you'd pay though if you came back, and that's when I remember seeing all the war movies was during those days. And Daddy was county agent, and we stayed there. We lived there until we moved to Athens in the year I was going to graduate from high school.
And then before, when you were very young, you guys, I think you moved to Monticello for a short time, but you ended up in Pine Mountain, and you had these experiences with FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, when he was president of the United States.
I was in the first grade, and we moved to Pine Mountain. Roosevelt, this is right after after World War I, really, in 1930s. President Roosevelt was trying to build the country up. There were so many poor people. And, this is when the government started the CDC and all these programs to help finance. And these people didn't have much education, and Daddy was hired to operate a resettlement. When people moved here, from Atlanta and places, and they were furnished a home, and they built their own homes. Groups of men would, be carpenters and different things like that. It was relocating of impoverished farm families, and I remember a big cannery where you had a garden, and everybody, it was like a community garden, but a community canning plant. And you could, can enough vegetables, just go through the winter. So that was a great success.
You were right in the middle of the Great Depression. I mean, the stock market crashed like 2 or 3 months before you were born. You grew up in those days. This was right in Depression. I guess Roosevelt, that's when he was doing his New Deal thing. Is that right? That's
right. And you remember the song "Happy Days Are Here Again"?
Yes.
That was when he was running for office.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you had some sightings of him when he rode by in his car.
I did. He had a convertible, and he had to have hand gears, and I have photographs of him just laughing, looking at the crowd. We would all be lined up out in front of the grammar school where my daddy was principal, and it's just fun to wonder, which one of those heads is mine in that circle. But
because you were in first grade and got to stand on the front row.
I was a front rower. Yeah. And I think, and also something that was interesting, I was one of 7 biddies in the first grade, and I tried to figure out why everybody was naming their babies Betty. I don't know about when Betty Grable came along.
That is great.
It was funny.
And you have a great picture of him riding by in the convertible, and I think you mentioned that his daughter, she actually got out, right? Got out of the vehicle right in front of you.
Yeah, I don't know why she had to move into a different car, but she did. But I looked, and she had on saddle Oxfords, but no socks, and that I couldn't figure that out, and I still don't know the answer. But it was just funny, and he came because we lived there only 1 year, and I don't remember how many times he came, but it was more than one. He felt, I did this, I think, and he says, yeah.
Oh yeah,
and he was helping America.
Oh, there's no question. There's no question. So
yeah.
You obviously had great parents.
Absolutely.
And it's always traces back. You have your children had great parents. Let's just be real. And there's a reason for that. But you saw a lot of stuff in your parents as a kid. And one of the things that you mentioned is, number one, you guys were always in church. And I couldn't help but laugh when I saw that one of your favorite songs as a kid was Bringing in the Sheaves. And that's people listening to this have never heard of that song in their life. I haven't heard it in a long time. In the Methodist Church in Reynolds, I used to sing, we were bringing in the cheese and not the sheaves. That's what I couldn't figure out, who was bringing in the cheese, but I remember that song. But you have great memories of growing up in the church, right, with your parents.
Absolutely.
And they were very active.
Yeah, everywhere we lived, and that was good many places, they quickly got involved with the church and stayed with it and really became attached to the community through the church.
Yeah, and folks, you're going to find this out in a little bit, but I'll fast forward it, put a comment here. When Miss Cleveland, when she finally moved to Fort Valley after she got married to her husband, and we're going to talk about that, one of the first things she did was join the church. And that jumped out at me in your story because just what you just said, that was very important in your family. They quickly got involved in the church. You did exactly the same. So the other thing that you mentioned is that your family was very frugal, and you learned from that. You watched that. Just talk about a little bit about the frugality that you saw as a kid. I mean, you guys took great trips. I remember you went to Louisville one time, and I think you went to the World's Fair. I may have that wrong, but
no, you do.
You saw parents who were very frugal. Conservation was very important.
I'll talk about 2 different trips. One to Louisville. My sister was beginning, she had been to college and graduated from Bessie Tip, and she thinking she was going to be a missionary. So she went to what they called some kind of training school at Louisville where they train preachers and stuff. She didn't want to be a preacher. She wanted to be a missionary, and did for some summers. And then she finally married a minister, and they went a lot of different churches in Georgia and Florida. So. And what was the other thought?
Well, I was just talking about that you took trips, but your parents were very frugal. They didn't throw money away, and it could be because obviously one thing because it was during the Depression when you were growing up, but they obviously did well. They did better than most people. I remember one comment you made. You were very offended when some kid looked at you and thought you were better off financially than they were. Do you remember that?
I do remember that. That was at Hartwell. Yeah, and we, this is the beginning of the lunchroom program, and we, before that we took sandwiches. Or we lived so close to the school that we could go home to lunch, which was, you don't do that anymore. But we during these times there would be things like, no, you just didn't have any leftovers. You save them for the next meal. And I had a dress made from fabric that had been a chicken sack, a chicken feed sack, and it's just interesting to remember all that. And grits, when Mama would cook grits, she'd always cook enough to have enough for another meal, and second meal she would just fry them and put an egg with them and butter, and that was good. And frugality was the way of life back then.
I remember Mama saying just the other day, they didn't take trips until Grandpa thought it was time he wanted to show his family around. And that's when they started taking trips. They were frugal, but they wanted to expose you to the rest of the United States.
And speaking of frugality and trips, we were in New Jersey, and riding along, and Daddy stopped at a road we needed to turn, and he turned, and apparently he wasn't supposed to, and he told the policeman who stopped him, well, in Georgia we can turn right on red, and he said, buddy, you're not in Georgia anymore. And that was a little bit embarrassing.
Yeah, I remember that story. That's great. Tavy, you can answer this frugality that she saw. I'm sure we're going to talk about some more of what she's done, even with her grandkids, with the investment club. I know that was passed down to you guys, right?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I remember in high school, I think, I was only allowed one Bobby Brooks outfit a year, and that kind of grated on me.
Yeah. And the truth is, they could have afforded much more, but they were teaching you a lesson. In spite of the frugality, and in spite of being in a depression, Mr. Cleveland, you saw parents who were very generous. They were generous with their time and money, I know, at the church. But you've got memories of getting in the car and on Christmas, not really knowing where you're going, but your parents driving you to a needy family and giving them Christmas presents.
I'll never forget it. It was in Hart County, and Daddy, like you said, loaded us up with a bag of oranges and little, like Baby Ruths, the candy pieces, and peppermints and things like that, and went out in South Hart County, and the little children came with their heads out the door, and we didn't get out. Daddy did, and took the food in. It was cold and snowy, but you don't forget things like that.
Yeah, so. I have my mother and Daddy. My mother instigated it, but when we were growing up, almost every Christmas, on Christmas Eve, we would have a couple of people that were not a part of our family that would not have had a Christmas if not for Mama bringing them, and they would open up presents just like us. And when I read that, I hadn't thought about that in a long time, but it hit me that, wow. So, the interesting thing here, they were frugal, but they were generous. And maybe they were generous because they were frugal. Or maybe, right. But what a lesson that we can learn, that they didn't throw money away on themselves, but they gave it away to people that needed. The Homer Littleton story is a great story, and this is almost a lifelong commitment they made to him, right? Talk about
That's
Homer.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. He lived next door, well, in the country. You might not call it next door, but he and Daddy grew up together, and he promised Homer that, when Homer went over to Nigeria, Daddy would, send him money and help him. And we were by no means of means.
Right.
So,
that's what I know. I mean, I get. Yeah. It's right. But he did this for a long time, right?
He did. And Homer would send up. I have some little carvings that he would send us just every once in a while to just show his appreciation for that. And they stayed over there a long time.
Yeah, it wasn't a one-time deal. He was a lifelong supporter of him. And then the generosity towards the Georgia Baptist School of Nursing is another story that hit home with me.
Yeah. Daddy was fortunate enough to, when we moved to Athens later on, and he bought a house on Prince Avenue, and in several years after that, this is when grocery stores were being built and houses were being torn down that looked bad, and they would, just sort of renovating things. And when he sold property, he always tithed it and gave and get to the Georgia Department of the nursing program. He knew how to manage the money. He would save it until an appropriate time and things like that. And he was very dedicated, very.
So the lesson is, and folks, just so you know, I've got Miss Betty Cleveland, who's 93 years old. Her daughter Tavy is sitting next to her, and we're talking about a principle that most people don't understand today. She saw in her parents people who grew up in the worst of times. I mean, Miss Cleveland grew up in the worst of time, but she saw her parents managing money, being frugal with what they did, and being generous and giving money away and helping people. And they were not like they had means to do this, but he managed their finances so they could. So, it gets down to what kind of life do we want to live? Do we want to live a life where we buy everything we see because we can afford it? Or do we want to live a life that we don't buy everything we see and buy just what we need so we can be generous to other people? And I think the answer to that question is pretty easy. Georgia Baptist School of Nursing, I'm trying to think how my daddy's first cousin, whose name was Nita Marshall, and she died when she was about 98 years old, but she was the head of nursing there for many years. And when I saw that, that's why it just struck a chord with me. So, Miss Cleveland, I'm going to change gears a minute, and I'm going to get back to, I'm not sure where you were on December the 7th, 1941, but there's not a lot of people around now that can talk about where they were on December 7th, 1941, when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden we were in a world war. Talk about that day.
But it was on a Sunday. A lot of people will remember. And I was next door at the Lewis house, our good neighbors, and they had a daughter about my age. And she'll never forget, Sunday afternoon, and Ms. Lewis had the radio on, and all of a sudden they said, they're bombing Pearl Harbor, they're bombing Pearl Harbor. And we just couldn't believe it. I ran home because I was scared. That was frightening to hear about Americans being killed. And of course, at that time, we didn't know how bad it was. But that was such a shock because we'd been at peace all this time, and here comes, we had the German war in the theater over there, but the Japanese just were so bold and just, bombing all of our ships and losing so many Americans.
And that's a day you'll never forget, and there's really not a lot of people around that can talk about that. My generation can talk about what was going on September 11th, 2001. And
right.
Tavy, I know you remember right where you were when that happened, as I do, right?
Oh, exactly. Yeah.
And there's people that will listen to this that won't remember that either. But we're talking about a world war starting, and you've had a cousin that you were very close to, Robert Harrison, right? Just talk about your relationship with him. He
lived in Martin, the same little place my grandmother lived. And we played with him all our lives. He was a little bit older than I was. There were two children in the family, Robert and Ruth. And Robert volunteered to go fight. And so he did. And he landed up in England just before the D-Day invasion. And the ironic thing about that is his sister Ruth and I and a couple more cousins and an aunt were in Washington, D.C., the day D-Day, and we'd been there about a week. And one morning before we got up, we heard bells ringing, and it was church bells all over town, signaling that D-Day had occurred, the invasion was going on, and many Americans were killed. Robert was not killed that day. It was later on in July when in invading France that he was killed.
He was killed during the Normandy invasion that started and kept going, right?
Right.
But it had to be heartbreaking. It's one thing for a war going on and you seeing what's going on in the world and how many people are getting killed, but then have a person that you grew up with, that's your relative, get killed, had to be life-changing, right?
It was so sad, and the whole little town of Martin, and just was mourning his loss. And he was such a good guy. He was just, as far as I was concerned, he was a perfect young man.
Right.
But,
so let's go back to Athens. And she lived in Hart County for a short time. She lived over in Pine Mountain area, and then she grew up in Hart County, and then moved to Athens her senior year in high school. And then all of a sudden you meet this guy named Grover Cleveland, who had just come back from the war, I think. And
right.
Talk about your Valentine date with him and how that went. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, I'll never forget that. We had an active youth group at Prince Avenue in Athens, and it was college students, and Grover was there. I was a freshman, and he had been in the Navy and had gotten out of the Navy and had come back to Georgia. He needed another 2 quarters is all he needed to graduate. Well, his sister Hazel married my first cousin, Jerry Walters, and he had started a fertilizer business in Athens. And when Grover had just gotten out of the Navy, and he was enrolling at Georgia, and Mom and Daddy had to have an empty apartment at that time. And so when Hazel and Jerry moved there one day, they said, we want to bring, they called him Junior, by. And we met, and sort of the rest is history. But we had a fun dating time. Oh, and let me tell you about this party that was Valentine's, when we first started dating. I was taking trig that quarter, and I had to study really hard. He had called 2 different times wanting a date, and I said, I got a test, and I just got to study. So he said, okay. So he called then on a Friday, and it happened to be Valentine's Day. And I said, okay, if you'll go on to church with me to our party. And he said, sure. And he brought a friend. There was this friend in college, and I got my girlfriend, and we double dated. But when we went to the party, and one of the games in the party was they gave us, you remember those little candy hearts that looked like calamine or something. But anyway, the game was every girl was given 10 hearts, and she had to go up to a guy and say, will you marry me? And he said yes. She gave him a heart. So, and of course, here was Grover, didn't know me much from Adam. But anyway, I'd been around that group a long time, and I felt, I knew who would say yes to me. And I did that. And then, and one other girl, Betty Harville, and I got everybody we asked said yes. So we won the contest.
So Daddy always loved to joke around. Our first date, she asked me to marry her.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. That is great.
Yeah.
So then you get married. You move to Fort Valley, Georgia. Now that had to be a little bit of an adjustment, right?
It really was.
Although you were so close to your family, for some strange reason, you really didn't feel very homesick. You got settled in pretty quickly, but talk about what it was like to move to Fort Valley, Georgia.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Well, at first, Papa Cleveland and them, there's a house next to theirs that we were going to live in, but they had a little bit of painting and renovating. So we stayed with Anna Mae and Papa Cleveland for about 2 weeks, and then we moved next door to our little house, and we lived there for until 1970, and just kept going. Had our 3 children and enjoyed life.
Well, you made a name for yourself in Fort Valley, that is for sure. He already had his name there for sure, and his family went back a lot of years. But you made a name, ended up teaching a lot of people, got very involved in the church quickly. But you also, all of a sudden, you saw what full-fledged farming looked like. And you guys were farming, especially at the beginning with peaches. And you had another infamous day happen on March the 26th, 1955, with the big freeze. Talk about that.
Oh, goodness, that was horrible. We knew the cold weather was coming. And, of course, you can't protect a whole peach orchard. And so you just have to take it. And every tree on this farm was burnt, beyond, it was just frozen, except one. And Papa Cleveland, it was in the Dixie Gem orchard across from our house. And he found that one, and he was sharp enough to take page, fence wire and wrap it around the peach, and the peach, no bird could get to it. And so I still have the seed from that one peach.
You lost all the peaches except for one peach, and
and I don't know if anybody else did that or not, but we were fortunate enough to save that one because
the bigger story is the perils of growing peaches, and that will, I think, lay the foundation for what you guys did later when you became more diversified in farming and have been very successful farming. But I do want to go back and just mention your teaching career. I know I read Mr. Anderson, who obviously was my superintendent. I remember him well. I know his kids. And he kind of came and talked you into teaching. And you figured with the farming perils, but the freeze happened 5 years after you guys got married, but you probably figured with the perils of farming that it'd be a good idea to teach a little bit to make some other money because you didn't know what was going to happen, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, let me go back to something I meant to say a while ago when we were talking about how hard work pays off and everything.
Yeah.
When I was in high school, a librarian made a survey, and her main questions were, who you're going to marry and what you're going to do with your life. And as it turned out, in the study and the survey and all, it said that you'll probably marry a farmer and you'll teach school.
No, it was that you didn't want to. You said what you said is that you didn't want to marry a farmer and that you didn't want to teach school.
And the irony of it, that's what I did. Yeah.
And she not only married a farmer, from what I read, she became an expert in farming. She was learning as she went, so she probably learned everything you needed to know about that. So another interesting story to me is, and one of the things that I know you saw in your parents and you and your husband did, you had great friends, and you spent time with people. And you had a couple of friends that I smile because I used to do the same thing, that Mr. Cleveland would go and do some sign language and say, do you want to go eat catfish tonight? And you would drive. I guess you guys were driving way up to Barnesville then. Is that where you were going to eat catfish? Yeah. So you wouldn't even have to say a word, right?
No, he just took his hand like a platter, and then he'd make a curved top like a platter of slaw. That was their main feature, but other than the fish. And that was all the signal Danny needed, and he just would nod, and we'd go pick him up, go up there for supper.
Just had friends that you didn't have to get ready, just people. And you had a lot of other friends, obviously, in Fort Valley, that people that live in the bigger cities don't get that, don't understand that you really just walk into somebody's house and spur the moment and do whatever. It's a great way to grow up. For sure. I want to go back to your teaching career because I started it and I changed channels, I think. But you had a wonderful career. I mean, you impacted a lot of folks. And I remember vividly the yearbook, and it was before you taught me, but you were Teacher of the Year, a star teacher that had like a cover of a Time magazine in the yearbook. So you had a great run teaching.
I did. And I felt so privileged to take, when Miss Thelma retired, that I got to teach, and I loved literature. In fact, Mr. Anderson came to talk to me about moving up to high school. I was in the elementary school, and I said, I'm really happy here, Mr. Anderson. I'd really rather stay. And he said, okay, you come 1 year over to the high school, and if you still want to go back, I'll let you. But after I got to high school, I liked it so much that I didn't give it a second thought.
Wow. The other thing I know you're very proud of, and you should be, is, and I'm not sure what year it was, you can help me, but when you guys built your new home, and Josh Carroll is saying, let me build you a home, and you guys begin to think that may be a good idea. And just tell that story, because that's a very touching story, because your husband had to end up building it himself, right? Had to finish it anyway.
Yeah, it turned out to be a sad story, but but yeah, one day Josh Carroll, he and Grove, they're cousins, and he would stop by every once in a while, and he stopped by, and apparently he'd been thinking about this a while, but we had no inkling, didn't think about building a house, but and we said, well, we'll think about it, and
He offered to build it for you.
yeah, he offered it. He said, I'll build it, and he told us about he had built his own house, and he had 4 children, and of course we had 2 at that time, or 3 maybe. Anyway, he was just a great friend, and but he started it after a lot of discussion and everything, and he started it in the spring, and soon it became harvesting time, and he had to stop building on the house and harvest his corn. And one day he was on a corn puller and hit something in the road, and he was on his farm. It was not on the highway, and it bounced him off, and he was killed, and that just devastated everybody, and it was so sad. But then Grover didn't know what he thought. Well, I'll just hold off a while. But then he realized he had some carpentering help here, so they got to work on it. But it was 4 years before we could move in. But
you ended up getting exactly what you wanted, didn't you?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah,
I did.
Yeah. Well, it's a wonderful story. So I think I remember you retired in 1991. Am I right? I'm not looking at that. I'm saying it by memory.
Exactly right.
So
yeah.
you have had a really wonderful retirement, and there's several things that, of course, you had many years with your husband before he passed away, and
Yeah.
we'll talk about that as being retired. You had that, but you've got this insatiable thirst for learning, and you've made some trips, and just let's talk a little bit. Some of the trips were just for fun, but you've also done some trips in your retirement that most people don't think about. I know you went pretty soon after your retirement. All you girls, Cleveland girls, went to New York City. I know that had to be fun, right?
That was fun. That really was, grandchildren and all. And we just, Davy and Nancy and Beth and
the granddaughters.
Yeah, the granddaughter. Yeah. And we went to some plays. I don't remember which ones.
Ragtime.
Ragtime was one of the best. Yeah. Yeah.
And Radio City Music Hall. This was in December.
Right.
So everything was decorated for Christmas.
Oh,
yeah,
wow.
Proud from Poor Valley went, and it was just lots of fun. Yeah, and they still remember it.
There's 2 things that happened. It was great for you, but you created some memories for your girls and grandgirls that they will never forget. We just don't know. I don't think we understand the power of that kind of stuff, and it was just great to read about it. And then I'm trying to find my notes, but I know at some point you went to England.
I did.
And was that when you went to the lectures about the foreign policy? Was that in England or was that somewhere else?
No.
That was on Lake Erie. I forget, it was with Rhodes Scholar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was, it's an institute up there.
Yeah.
I forget the name of the location, but it's in upstate New York.
Chautauqua.
Yeah, Chautauqua.
Yeah.
Right.
A college friend and I, she knew all about it, and so she talked me into it. And what's the name of the city up there that's way away from downtown?
I don't remember.
But anyway, it was lots of fun, and we'd go to lectures, and there would be a worker from Department of State who knew all about Turkey and our government in Turkey, and then there'd be a different one from Japan, ambassadors and that was so informative.
Yeah, so my question is, you're a retired lady that had this wonderful life, but not many people say, let's go to New York to hear some lectures on foreign policy or whatever. Yeah. What piqued your interest in that?
Well, I had a good friend who had traveled a lot, Catherine Wells, and her mother had died, and her mother had been her traveling companion. So she said, would you think about it? And I said, I don't even know where that is. We flew into near Lake Erie. What's that? Anyway, but the Chautauqua is a fascinating place. It's it's like it's a place for scholars in a sense. And we would go to lectures, and it was for a solid week, morning and night, and none of them were boring. It was amazing.
And then, but you also went on an educational trip to England. It was not just sightseeing; you were getting educated there, right?
That's right. That's right. That was fun too. And we stayed in a dorm, and the cooks who normally, cook for students, they were great. There'd been a scare with the disease from beef, and we had
mad cow. Yep.
Yeah. And those cooks were so good. And we had rabbit, and we had fish, and we had chicken, but we had no beef.
But you were also learning. What was that about? Do you remember what they were teaching there?
It was plants, Gardens of England was the name of it, and that was so much fun. And I know my friend Catherine that I had mentioned before, she went with us, and it was really her idea. But the tours, we had a bus, and we had the same driver all the time, and he would take us to various gardens, the old gardens of England that they were just marvelous. It was springtime, and I never shall forget pollarded. I'd never heard that word, and that's what they do to trees, and just to chop them off like crepe myrtle, and it looks merciless, but we don't do that over here. But it was so much fun, and there was a lady.
You also went to Italy too, right?
I did.
You've had a great retirement. You've had a great life. It makes me smile.
I really have. And Grover, he wanted to farm. He didn't care. So I
right.
companion to just go. And it was, I have good memories.
What's the fun part of this is thinking about how we started this conversation. You grew up in the Depression, riding dirt roads, going to the theater to watch cartoons on Saturday morning, saving money so you could give money away. And now you get to that point in life, and you're able to your horizons are so much expanded from what anybody could ever even dream. It's just a great story. I've got to talk about the Normandy trip. I think you were on a cruise. You had signed up for this cruise. I think you knew you were going to Normandy, but they knocked on your door right before you got there and gave you a little bit of information that they wanted you to participate in. So talk about that.
Yeah, that was thrilling too. When I first saw the advertisement about the trip, it was mainly commemorating people who had died from World War II, and you had a relative, you qualified, and of course my first cousin Robert Harrison had died, and he was buried at cemetery near Normandy. And there was one other guy in the group who had a relative buried over there. It was cold weather, and all wrapped up. And we, in a bus, we went to the cemetery, and they gave us a wreath. It was a large wreath, and it took two of us to carry it. And we put it it's like an unknown soldier idea. The tomb. There was, no name on it or anything. But I felt so honored. I was real shocked when they knocked on the door in the boat and said, we want you to help us, in this process. And it was a unique pleasure.
Again, if you think about it, you were 14 or 15 years old when he got killed, and that was on another side of the world. And here you find yourself retired as a senior citizen, getting to walk up and really not knowing you were going to do this and put flowers there.
Yeah.
That is, again, just absolute amazing story. Another thing that caught my attention is you joined this investment club in Fort Valley with a bunch of other women, and you had a little goal in mind, and you did something for your grandchildren. Just briefly talk about that. And this goes back to what you were taught as a kid, I think, in managing money and being frugal.
Okay. Investment club. It was lots of fun. We didn't put much money in, but the experience of investing was just so much fun. And we'd meet once a month, really. And we would talk about which stock we were going to invest in. And I learned so much. I don't remember a whole lot out of it now, but it was just a bunch of ladies who were anxious to learn about finance and stuff. And so.
And you set up funds for each grandchild.
I
In
did.
their favorite stocks.
Yeah. Yeah.
You set up funds and you contributed to them and let them manage it, right? You gave it to them and let them learn a little bit about what you learned. What a great thing to do. It's just, again, I think it's an example of you giving back what you were taught. I want to move to the day your husband died. You guys had already celebrated your 50th anniversary. You had a wonderful life together. He was a character, I can tell. I knew him to be a man of integrity for sure. But he was quite a character, and I know as he began to get sick, there were very touching moments there. Tavia, I know they called you, and you flew in on a dime almost as quick as you could get here when you realized that this was going downhill. So just talk about that. Talk about the loss of the love of your life and how that impacted you. What year was that? 2011? Am I right?
11.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it was really sad. But after we knew he had cancer, I think he lived about 4 years.
One of her goals was just to make sure he was able, if it worked out for him to be able to die at home,
right.
And that worked out. Hospice was amazing, and it worked out real well.
It did.
It was hospice that called you, Tavia, right? Did I?
Yes, it was. Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, hospice was just so helpful. But there's on a more pleasant note, I want to tell you, and you probably read about it when he was, I don't know, he wasn't sick, but anyway.
He had a great sense of humor, is what you're going to give us a great example of that humor.
Yeah.
Right.
And he loved his cousin, Terry Tribble, and they would gather every once in a while up at Zenith's store, sit around the pot-bellied stove, and talk and carry on. And they were all sitting there, and Grover, Terry really had said, I'm not going to listen to you, Junior. I'm not going to listen to any more of your stories. Well, he did. He sat there, and Grover was, he said, I want to tell you all a story. He said, last Saturday night, Betty and I were exiting I-75 at Forsyth Hardeman exit, and it was cold and rainy. And as we turned, they're off to the right to go up the hill and down toward the hospital, an ambulance came flying by with its lights flashing and sirens blaring. And when the ambulance turned toward the medical center, the back doors flew open and a small cooler just slid out on the road. And of course, when we realized what was happening, we stopped and put the cooler in the car thinking to follow the ambulance. But the shock came when we looked inside the cooler and found a large human toe. And at that point, Grover paid for his purchase. He was at the store still, and left the store. And Terry jumped up and ran to the door, yelling, Junior, what'd you do? And Junior said, we didn't do anything. We just did the only logical thing you could do. We called a tow truck.
What a great story. And then, folks, the other lesson here, she had a wonderful life, many decades with her husband, but she's also figured out how to go on with life and to live life and as a widow. And somehow life goes on, and you take all the good and bad. You've had both of it in your life. We've talked about it. You've done pretty well by yourself, too, in living. And I know Grover would be very proud of what you do. I'm impressed. I don't know if you're still doing it. I was talking to my wife. We walk just about every day here. It's about 1.5 miles. But at 92, you were still walking 2 miles every day, right? Do you still do that?
93. I did it this morning.
Walk 2 miles. Does your dog still going with you?
Still going with me. Some days, if I don't go till about lunch, she won't go. I hadn't figured out that psychology, but she just sits there under the carport, and I go on and I come back, and she's still there. And
you love going out in your backyard. I think I read where you go out there every day to walk through. You've got obviously a beautiful backyard. They have church has Easter egg hunts out there and everything else. So you just love what God created, period, right? And these are right. And you're in the country, folks. She's in a farm and lives. Her house is on their farm, and so she's done well. I do want to talk briefly about what's going on now, the Cleveland farm. Obviously, there's a lot of history there. We won't get into all that. You learned a lot about farming, but what's going on now? Your son, David and I, by the way, folks, were fraternity brothers. We were friends in high school. I went to University of Georgia a year before David. I rushed him into the Lambda Chi Alpha fraternity. We were great friends all through college. We don't have any trouble striking up a conversation. We got a lot of memories together, but what began as mainly peaches, and we read about they lost everything one year. David and Beth, his wife, started this ornamental tree business, Cleveland Tree Company, that's done very well. He ships trees all over the United States.
Yeah, all over the country. I mean, my grandson
Yes.
gone into the pecan business, and he's
got the pecan trees that were on the farm, and he's
Right.
opened up he's got a shelling business, right? And he packages the pecans, right?
exactly, and he's doing a real good job.
And they switched into only organic. Well, it's organic as much as possible, organic pecans.
Yeah.
These folks are very accomplished. They're very successful farmers. Just as you've heard about their family, they're salt of the earth people. They're great people. I'm actually going to have Tom's wife on, Ashley, soon, and got a podcast with her talking about her relationship with her grandfather. She's so talented.
Absolutely.
I got to ask you a couple questions. I did not talk about, you've played the piano since you were a little girl. While everybody else was playing, you had to spend an hour a day playing the piano. I know that's brought you much joy throughout your life. You played for churches and you play piano. I guess you still playing the piano, aren't you, Miss Cleveland?
Not so much, but I enjoyed it when I did. Yeah.
You played it for many years. Just what a well-rounded. And then I suppose in your retirement years is when you began the painting, right? I mean, were you doing that all along, but you become an accomplished painter where you sell your paintings?
Yeah. Well, I started seriously in about 2002 and I loved it. And we have had an art group here, and Dodie Lovett taught, and then now we have a friend from Macon who comes and still teaches. I'm not too much in it, but I surely enjoyed it when I did.
What a balanced, wonderful life you've had. Let me ask you this. If you can sum up your life in a short sentence, what would you say?
My life wasn't perfect, but close.
I agree. There were some pitfalls. There was some heartache like everybody has. But when you look back, it turned out not perfect, but close. Wow.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Wow. Miss Cleveland, what's the greatest lesson you've learned about farming? As you've been a farmer's wife and the mother of farmers, what have you learned?
Mother Nature is in charge.
Period, right?
Period. No matter how good a farmer you are, Mother Nature is just in charge, and it's just, you can't get around it. But God too is in control. I'll say that.
Most farmers I've known have a huge respect for Mother Nature and God, simply because they know that what happens is out of their hands in a lot of ways, so they depend on God. For that's good stuff. What in your life are you most thankful?
My parents, they were salt of the earth parents, and it was consistent structure and discipline. And I recall at age 4 being in a high chair, and I don't know what was wrong with me, but I was angry, and I had a biscuit in my hand, and I threw it across the room, and I got a large spanking for that, and I have not had that problem anymore. That cured me of that.
That gave her, but she's thankful that her father did that. And ever since what she had written here is, ever since I have utmost respect for my parents, and that's how I've parented our children. Yeah,
it was passed down, and that's why your children are the way they are. That's why they are. So, what do you want? They probably know it, but maybe not. What do you want your children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren to know about you? Coming from your mouth, what is it that you want them to know? What do you think is the most important?
I want them always to do unto others as they would have them do to them. Put others first, in other words.
I know when I started this podcast, I know that there's this, when we get it out there, it's out there forever. And it's going to be, people potentially could listen to this after all three of us are dead and gone. What advice do you have for even your descendants who may not even be born yet, who will listen to this one day when we're all gone?
Listen carefully and realize that, your life is up to you, and just always do your best and listen to what God is telling you to do.
Tavy, I'm going to let you have a last word. I know that you realize you've had wonderful parents. You grew up in a wonderful place. There's a reason you had wonderful parents, and I know you guys are all doing the same thing. Wow.
We're trying.
Well, you are, but I know that you've got a special relationship with that lady that's sitting next to you right there, right?
Yes, I do. I'm lucky enough to get to come back here 6 weeks a year to be on the farm and to help.
And she lives in California, right outside of San Francisco, near the Silicon Valley. So she comes back and spends 6 weeks a year. Wow.
Yeah, I get to come spring, summer, and fall. And in the fall, there's the annual Jailhouse Alley art show.
Right.
I don't know if you've ever attended that.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that. Yeah.
Yeah, that's always the first Saturday in November. So I would always come for that and help with that.
Yeah. Caroline Brady Tilley.
Yes.
It's a part of that from Reynolds. Yeah. What a wonderful story, Miss Cleveland. You've honored me by talking through this. I'm just tickled to death to have this on here, to have your voice telling a little bit of your story.
And I appreciate this opportunity so much. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Tavy, thank you too for contributing to this. This is much fun. Thank you guys very much. Great to talk to you. Much fun. Thank you.
Bye, Bruce.
Bye-bye.
Sowing in the morning, sowing seeds of kindness, sowing in the noontime and the dewy eve, waiting for the harvest and the time of reaping, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.